For the kind invitation to come and speak to you all tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm really passionate about space and space law. I put together a PowerPoint, and I will try very hard to stay within time limits, which is never good. I know as a lawyer, time limits are so important, but as a space lawyer, you get a little bit of flack, I think. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Um, So, yeah, sorry. Okay. And hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, but if there are questions, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. As you know, I am the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law here in beautiful Oxford, Mississippi. We're really focused here on the commercial aspects of space and space law. So when we think about all of the great opportunities you guys will have in terms of where you go to study about space law, you would go, for example, if you want to learn about policy, you would go to GW. I mean, you can learn about policy here too, but that's what they focus on. If you want to really focus on the academic aspects of public international law, you would go to McGill. If you want to work in Europe, you would go to Leiden. But if you are interested in supporting U.S. commercial industry or any commercial industry, space industry really, then you're going to come to us at Mississippi, because that's really what the focus of our research is on. As mentioned, I'm also the co-founder, president, and CEO of For All Mankind. In addition to being the only organization in the world that focuses on protecting human heritage in outer space, we are entirely volunteer. We have more than 100 lawyers from all around the world. Every continent except Antarctica is represented. And we really just want to create a treaty that will protect human heritage in outer space. We are also a permanent observer to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And so that gives me a very, very interesting sort of perch on watching international space law be developed. We recently stood up our Institute on Space Law and Ethics, and the mission of that institute is to ensure that ethics serve as a foundational guiding principle in shaping the evolution of legal and normative frameworks governing this, the exploration and use of outer space. What I hope that you learned from my presentation today is that the laws are very spare right now that we have, and we are not, as an international community, as I'm sure you are all aware, in a very good place to make new collaborative efforts for new law. And so at For All Mankind, we believe that we might not be able to agree on specific laws, but there are certain very basic human ethical things that we think all nations, all countries, all humans can agree to. And we want to find those and use those as a basis for agreement in space. I would just like to draw attention to two amazing individuals that we lost very recently. Ken Mattingly was an Apollo 16 astronaut. Frank Borman was an Apollo. And it's really important as we understand sort of where we're going in space. It's really important to understand our history in space. And one thing that is really remarkable when you think about it is we have not sent a human, not one country has sent a human to the moon in more than 50 years. So that really gives you an idea of what these individuals did 50 years ago, when we really had no business technologically to be in space at that point, much less landing on the moon. The fact that we haven't been able to replicate that shows just what an incredible achievement that was. But we are coming close. So we had this past summer an incredible landing by India, the first ever soft landing on the lunar South Pole. And that was just amazing on so many levels, because you have a country that's not the US, China, or Russia. Basically, it took this as a heralding a new era in the space age, where we're seeing lesser developed countries, where we're seeing the cost of this mission, the cost of this successful landing on the lunar South Pole was less than many Hollywood blockbuster movies. So this was a whole new way of doing space. And when India landed on the moon successfully, it said, we are doing this, we are doing this as part of the global south. This is a new era of space. And it is, but it wasn't just that. What I found really interesting about this mission was what happened just a few days before this mission. So when India announced that it was going to land on the lunar South Pole, have a soft impact, Russia said, oh, nobody's done that before. You know what? We're going to send our mission now to Luna 25. Luna 25 was a mission that had been developed with the European Space Agency because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The European Space Agency pulled out of the mission. Russia said, well, we can still do it. So Russia very hurriedly sent Luna 25 up to the moon. And what happened just days before Chandrayaan landed on the moon, Luna 25 crashed on the moon. So I want you to think about, a lot of people will say, oh, let's not call it a race. This is a different era. This isn't a Cold War race to the moon. It is very much a race. It's a race on so many different levels, and that's a good thing. But here, the other thing I want you to think about when we look at these lunar impact sites is we are reaching an era now where we have more than 100 missions planned in the next 2 years. And it's kind of silly now to send something that pretty good certainty is probably not going to succeed. And so we really have to start now thinking differently about the moon. Why are we just sending stuff up there to crash on it? We want to be able to be responsible about our exploration. And so when we think about, why was it so important for Russia to try and beat India to the moon? Well, because we have the Artemis Accords, and we have now 32 nations that have signed on to these accords. They are viewed as a U.S. effort. It certainly is an idea that has its genesis in the United States. The Artemis Accords are supporting the Artemis program, sending the first woman and the first person of color back to the moon. But it's really important if you speak to the people who negotiated the Artemis Accords. It's very important to understand that the United States did come up with the first draft, but the first original 8 signatories pushed back a lot on that draft. So this is not some sort of pronouncement by the United States as much as Russia would like to portray it as such. As they negotiated, albeit with a small multilateral contingent. But we do have now the Artemis Accords with 32 signatories, including India. And so it's a race because China and Russia are saying, well, okay, hey, Artemis, we are going to have our own plan to go back to the moon. We're gonna partner together to establish a joint moon base. This announcement was made just a couple weeks after the United States announced and 7 allies announced the Artemis Accords. However, in speaking to Chinese space policy lawyers and policymakers, my understanding is that it was not actually a reaction to Artemis. It was something that China and Russia had planned. So although it is definitely a competition, definitely a race, the U.S. announcement of the Artemis Accords didn't sort of push this or accelerate this plan. And so the China-Russia International Lunar Research Station project now has these countries. Again, so this is our competition with the Artemis Accords. This is our race with the Artemis Accords. Why is it important to get a lot of partners? Well, let's think about it from a diplomatic and a public international point of view, right? The more countries, when you get to the moon, the more countries that say, oh yeah, that was right, that's legal, the better. And so, in the eyes of this race, at this particular race, we have the United States 32 to China 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? And so it's really interesting from a diplomatic standpoint to see what's happening with this race. And it's not just a race to get people and countries on your side. Where is everybody going? Everybody is going to the South Pole of the moon. Why is everybody going there? Because it's a very unique features. We believe that there is water ice collecting on the bottom of these very deep craters because the sun cannot get into those craters. And so water just sits there and collects, right? And so the added benefit of being on the lunar South Pole is the tops of these craters are very high, and they're called the peaks of eternal light because even though the craters themselves are very deep and never see sunlight, the rims of the craters are in sunlight for 24 hours a day. And so that means any instruments you send to the lunar South Pole, if you can get it on that edge in the right way, you don't have to shut down for the really frigid 2-week long lunar lunar night. So this is an optimal place to go because you can keep your operation running the whole time. You don't have to worry about insulation and turning off and turning back on. And your water which can be used to as nutrients for your astronauts and can be used as fuel if you separate the hydrogen and the oxygen, is right there waiting to be collected. So it's a race to get to that lunar South Pole. We also know that our orbit is getting very crowded, and so it is a race against time to wake the world up to the fact that we have to clean up our orbit. We are in something called the Kessler syndrome right now. If we do not, even if we were to stop launching, if we do not do anything to clean up our orbit, all these pieces of debris are going to start hitting each other, and they're going to create more debris, and we're eventually not going to be able to get out of our own orbit because there's too many particles in there damaging our spacecraft. And in fact, ISS had to maneuver twice to avoid potential collisions in 2023. The good news is we do have companies that are looking at orbital debris remediation, and it's a race. We have Astroscale, which has sweeping things to clean it up. Cislunar Industry, which is I love this idea of creating a forge. Let's not just drag it down into the atmosphere because goodness knows what it's doing to our atmosphere, but let's recycle it. And there's Orbit Guardians and ClearSpace, and this is just a small number of the companies looking at this. But think about what it means to clean up our orbit. It means you're getting very close to another satellite. It means you're able to grapple onto that satellite and do something with it, move it, repair it, whatever. Those are called proximity, RPO activities, rendezvous and proximity operations. And so that's great for being able to clean up your garbage, but it also means that if you have the technology to get that close to another satellite, you can use that to spy on another satellite and understand the capabilities of your enemies. So we have this race to clean up our orbit, but there's a distrust there. Like how are we going to do that transparently so that we will trust that the Chinese really are just cleaning up and not actually spying on us? So the other thing that we have is constellations in Leo, right? So again, it's a race right now. Starlink, there are more than, I think as of today, there are 5,000 Starlink satellites launched and on orbit. We have Kuiper coming, right? And then China has announced that it is going to have 13,000. Rwanda has announced that it's going to have 40,000. So our orbit's going to get really crowded with these satellite constellations in Leo. And you can see there's two issues with it. So not only are we're talking about perhaps 100,000 little satellites in space, the Starlink satellites are disrupting the field of vision of the astronomers. Now, to be fair, it's not just Starlink satellites. All satellites are making it difficult for astronomers to see. And so what are we talking about with this race? We're talking about how are we going to balance being able to see? And why is it important to be able to see? Sure, we want to understand where we came from, but there's a very, very specific reason. Planetary defense. There are asteroids out there that we need to be able to see before they get too close to us so we can try and avoid them. We don't want to go the way of the dinosaurs. And this is my slide about the constellations in Rwanda. And I just point out, that they filed an intent to launch 327,000, but Rwanda itself has never launched a satellite. And it's being done with this commercial company, eSpace. We also have a race with orbital tourism. I don't know if you remember the very first sort of suborbital flights That summer there was sort of a, is it going to be Blue Origin, is it going to be Virgin Galactic? And Virgin Galactic was the first to send tourists into space, and Jeff Bezos was like, yeah, you didn't really get to space because you didn't get high enough, right? He actually had a tweet like that. But it's a race. Who's going to get better? Who's going to get their tourists up there farther? And we have Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, we have the Inspiration 4 missions, the Polaris missions, Axiom missions to the space station. So it's a race to get a foothold in this very new lucrative industry of space tourism. And private space stations. ISS, the International Space Station, is going to be decommissioned in 2030. The United States is relying on getting a private space station up in their orbit and functioning before then. And so it's a race with the private space stations. We have Axiom, Starlab, Orbital Reef, VAST, and perhaps even Northrop Grumman. And I leave the question mark because VAST was never announced what it was doing up until May 2023. So we didn't even know that this company was planning on building a space station until May 2023. And they might be the first up there. And of course, there's lunar tourism. So, the people want to go to the moon, and they're going to be capable of doing that. And in fact, we have a mission right now, the Dear Moon mission, which is planning on going around the moon. So think about that. This is a really interesting mission because this gentleman paid for everybody. 13 people are going to go, and he hand selected who was going to go, and they are all social media influencers. So and artists. So that's really cool. We're getting now going to space, a group of people who are not astronauts, who haven't been trained. But okay, that's really scary too, because we all know what happened to Apollo 13, and this is supposed to go around the moon. And so I want you to think about, okay, what happens if something happens to them when they are on the far side of the moon? What is the taxpayers' obligation to rescue these people? And we have vanity payloads. So this is, again, an interesting one. If you have enough money, you can send anything you want to the moon. Astrobotic is going to the moon with a bunch of ashes from, I think it's about 40 different individuals. They're launching on Christmas Eve. You can send a keepsake to the moon. So this is kind of a race. This personally bothers me. Now, I don't want the government to come in and tell me what I can and cannot send to the moon, but I do think we need to stop thinking about the moon as someplace where we can just dump stuff, and start thinking about it as a destination. You wouldn't go to Yellowstone and just leave your stuff there, right? You're going to want to protect it, or not Yellowstone, because that's not a national park. I mean, you wouldn't even do that at City Hall or your neighbor's yard, right? We have to really start thinking differently, and it's a race for us to get people to start thinking differently, because these missions are going in a matter of weeks. And finally, we have lunar mining, and this is what I opened with, the concept of the lunar, getting to the water ice on the lunar South Pole. These are pictures of 2 crash landings from commercial entities. The one with the little blue X is Bereshit, and that was an Israeli space mission that crash landed in 2019. And the other one is an iSpace mission, a Japanese company that crash landed this past spring. So again, it's not just countries; these are private companies that are going, and they're not being successful, but this is, again, think about all of this activity that's going to the moon. It's a race, and a lot of things are slipping through the cracks. Bereshit, which crash landed on the moon, actually was carrying a bunch of these little guys. These are microscopic creatures called tardigrades. Why would you send tardigrades to the moon? Because tardigrades are known to be able to survive the vacuum of space. And we know that because French researchers actually put them on the outside of a rocket, and they survived. But nobody knew that these tardigrades were being sent to the moon. Now, the moon it's considered a category 2. We're not worried about mucking up life on the moon, but it is a little worrisome that you can literally send anything you want to the moon and nobody will even ask questions at this point. And finally, we have asteroid mining. And I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson who said, the first trillionaire is going to be made asteroid mining. And you have a lot of economists saying, well, no, because if you bring back that much supply, the cost is going to go down. But the point is, whether we are mining asteroids to bring resources back to Earth, or whether we're doing it so that we can fuel further exploration, asteroid mining is a thing. And so it's a race. It's a race to get to the far side of the moon. It's a race to get to the asteroids. It's a race to get to build that first commercial space station. It's a race to be the first company to clean up our orbit. It's a race to be the first country that builds a lunar habitat on the moon, and so forth and so on. So I want to talk a little bit about space policy, because I want you to understand why we at Mississippi are focused on commercial space. It's because space policy is focused on commercial space. This is the United States Space Priorities Framework that was released by the Biden administration in December 2021. So we see that, there's an understanding at this administration that space is really important. And I also want to point out, space is bipartisan. If you think about the transition from Trump to Biden and all the things that Biden stopped or ended or whatever, space was continuous. All of the programs that Trump initiated were continued in the Biden administration. We are headed finally in this one direction, and there has been a continuity that we haven't seen in the U.S. space program in a while. So again, going through the Space Priorities Framework, the United States is committed to bolstering the health and vitality of all of its space sectors, including its commercial space sector. The number one priority is to maintain a robust and responsible U.S. space enterprise. And that means enabling a competitive and burgeoning U.S. commercial space sector. We go on, and not only is it in the U.S., we want to create free and fair market competition internationally as well. So the United States is going to work internationally to make sure that commercial activities.
I've seen this already, I want to drink this almost every afternoon.
Sorry.
Okay. No worries.
Sorry about that.
And then we see the United States is committed to protecting space-related critical infrastructure, that it will work with commercial space and industry in order to build and support that. The United States will defend its national security interests, and that's going to include commercial space. And we see more Biden policies. We're seeing that the Biden administration is looking to accelerate the in-space servicing, assembling, and manufacturing national strategy. It is directed its Department of Homeland Security to accept innovations driven by the commercial space sector. It wants DHS to support resilience of government and private space sector-based systems. We have this commitment on the direct ASAT missile tests, sort of looking at these, again, more specific Biden policies. I won't go into them in detail, but again, you see that strengthening cooperation with the commercial sector, working with for-profit companies, and even the NASA Act. Even the mission of NASA includes seeking and encouraging to the maximum extent possible the fullest commercial use of space, and encouraging and providing for federal government use of commercially provided space services consistent with the requirements. And not only NASA, our defense strategy also includes capturing emerging technologies in the commercial sector, increasing collaboration with the private sector, and be a fast follower where market forces are driving commercialization. So again, you see the U.S. strategy is really wrapped up in the support of commercial enterprise. So where does that all fit in international space law? So this is literally all of international space law. You can fit all of international space law on one PowerPoint slide. Down on the larger document, the larger list you see there are the binding and enforceable treaties. There are actually just 4 that are widely ratified. The Moon Agreement of 1984 has only been ratified by 19 countries, and Saudi Arabia is actually withdrawing from it as of January 2024. So only 18 ratifications. So the Moon Agreement is a binding treaty, but it only binds 18 countries. The United States, China, Russia have not signed the Moon Agreement and are not bound by it. The smaller documents are what we call soft law. These are non-binding resolutions that have come through the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Now, you can see we have not had a successful binding agreement since 1976. And so the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space has been using what it's called soft law to sort of help guide and keep the peace in space, and they've done a really, really great job. What's really important about when we think about these resolutions is anything that comes out of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space comes out via consensus, which makes it really hard because any country, and this is the original committee members of the COPUOS, now there are 104, and any one of those 104 countries can say, no, I don't like this word, or I don't like that sentence, or I'm not going to vote for this, and then the resolution doesn't pass. So you can see why these resolutions have a little bit more weight, perhaps, than a resolution that you voted against, because all of these came out of the UN COPUOS unanimously, essentially. So we're going to talk about the Outer Space Treaty, and I just wanted to show you when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated within the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. These were the members of the committee, and the ones in red were additions when the Soviet Union complained that the deck was stacked against them. So that is not really representative of the world, right? So we are living bound by a treaty negotiated in 1967 by these select few countries. Not only that, but when I was growing up, long before you guys were around, this is what we pictured when we talked about the universe. This was when we talked about space. You've probably seen these old charts somewhere, maybe elementary school, I don't know. This is what we thought about. This is what our solar system looks like, and there's the asteroid belt, and then that's it, right? And so when this treaty that we all abide by now was being negotiated, this is what we thought of space. Well, of course, now this is what we know space is. It's so much more, right? But what I think you'll find it really remarkable, what these negotiators were able to do, and be very sympathetic to what they were not able to do. So I say, mind the gap and the inconsistencies, even within the Outer Space Treaty. There are a bunch of gaps and inconsistencies, and it is our job today to fill those gaps and to treat those inconsistencies, and again, with an eye to supporting commercial industry. So the Outer Space Treaty is formally called the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. So really important, it's a treaty on principles. This isn't a code of conduct. This isn't going to your US code and saying, oh, it says you shall not, be a peeping Tom. They're just principles, and it governs the activities of states. It doesn't govern the activities of everybody, right? It governs the activities of states. It doesn't say of humans. And so it does reach to individuals, and it will see in Article 6, but the treaty itself was principles governing the activities of states. The fundamental precept of space is that exploration use shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and the exploration use of outer space are the province of all humankind. All of outer space shall be free for exploration use by all, and there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. So what did the negotiators want? They didn't want any restrictions on what you could do in space. We're going to see there's very few restrictions, and that is a problem now. One thing we need to think about is province of all humankind. What does that mean? Well, we know it means something less than common heritage of humankind. This is the Moon Agreement with only 17 signatories. And the debate about it is that common heritage of humankind suggests that space is a global commons, and that any benefit received from space has to be immediately shared. And so you can see the difference between province of all humankind and common heritage of humankind. Neither of these terms has a legal definition. However, no US president has ever considered space to be a global commons. And in fact, President Trump in April 2020 said the United States does not view space as a global commons. And not only that, we're never going to sign the Moon Agreement, and we're never going to pretend that the concept of common heritage is something that we accept. This is a April 2020 executive order. It has not been overturned or rescinded by the Biden administration. And Congress recently doubled down. A bill was introduced just a couple weeks ago, and it says in Section 80208, notwithstanding any other provision of law, outer space may not be considered a global commons. Okay, the United States does not consider space a global commons. People will tell you space is a global commons, and you will have to politely say, no, the Outer Space Treaty says space is the province of all humankind. The United States does not believe space is a global commons. Therefore, space is not a global commons from the perspective of the United States. Again, we don't have working definitions of either of those terms, but we know that province of all humankind is something less than that global commons. The exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries. This is a really interesting provision, right? Because a lot of people immediately jump to, oh, well, it's going to be carried out for the benefit of all. And people immediately think benefit, they think money. And this is what we see in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. If you mine the deep sea, you've got to share your profit, which is why space enthusiasts don't want space to be considered in the same manner that we consider deep sea. But what is the benefit? Well, you know what? First of all, the Outer Space Treaty frames interactions between states, not humans. So it does say, and for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, not all humans. Okay. Now I'm a lawyer, so to me it's like, well, why? What does that mean? I don't know. But this is such a fascinating treaty. It's just 2 pages long, and I teach a whole course just on it. But what is the difference between benefit sharing with humanity versus benefit sharing with states? And when do these benefits have to accrue? So if you think about it today, every single person on Earth has benefited from space. Every single person. And I always get one person who says, well, what about the uncontacted tribes in the middle of the Amazon? Guess what? They have benefited from space because we know they're there and we tell people not to go bother them. So they have inadvertently benefited from space. So when we think about for the benefit and interests of all countries, think big. And so when we think about going to mine the moon or an asteroid and sharing the benefit, well, we don't know what that benefit is yet. And so it makes no sense to say, well, you have to share the benefit, which we think will be this. No, that benefit will be shared because it's just going to benefit the entirety of humanity for us to explore. Of course, when we think about mining, the idea is to take all of the industrial mines off of Earth and be able to return Earth to a more pristine pre-industrial environment. Article 2 says that space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. This is called the non-appropriation principle. And there are a lot of inconsistencies inherent right within it. So it jives with Article 1, right? Free exploration and use, free access. So if you have free access, that means nobody can have property, because what is property? Property is the ability to exclude. You can't do that in space. But we see Article 12 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says, hey, we know that people are going to have facilities, and if you have a facility, you have to let people come and visit you. Well, building something on the moon, asteroid, feels like your occupation, so it feels like that should then violate Article 2. And then Article 3 says that international law applies in space, and the Declaration of Human Rights says that every individual has the right to own property in space. So what does that mean? That means you have to read Article 2 with all of this in mind. And so again, going back to who does this treaty apply to, it applies to states. Individuals are not going to claim based on sovereignty. Again, now my reading of Article 2 is not the accepted reading by any means, but I tell you because I want you to think about, words on a page can be interpreted in many, many ways. And then you think about, well, does it extend to the collection of dust particles? It says none of space can be appropriated. So what? We can't collect solar power? What does that even mean? And does that mean I can't pick up? If a meteorite falls into my backyard, right? I can pick it up, and that's mine. The U.S. government can't claim on it. If you live in the UAE, by the way, you can't. It becomes a property of the government. But I can pick that up in my backyard and it's mine. But if I go to the moon and pick up a speck of dust smaller, then it's not mine, pursuant to some interpretations of Article 2. The United States, President Obama in 2015 signed a law that says, okay, we hear you, Article 2, but we are going to interpret Article 2 to mean that you can't claim territory, but you can extract resources. So under US law, extracting resources is not a violation of Article 2. Luxembourg, UAE, Japan, and India. Luxembourg, UAE, and Japan have all passed similar laws. India just announced a space policy with the same concept. The Artemis Accords contains the same concept in their section 11 and section 10. And that has been signed by 32 countries. So we're starting to get a little bit, and again, it's a race because there are some people who believe, no, extracting those resources does violate Article 2. So it's a race to see which interpretation is going to prevail. We talked about Article 3, international law applies to space. It has never been a lawless, wild, wild west. Article 4 is one of the only provisions that actually puts a hindrance on that freedom of access and exploration and use. You cannot place nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction anywhere in space. It also says that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. And again, if you think about it, why did I highlight that? Because it doesn't say space shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. So you can use orbit, you can use, and if you're not on the moon or another celestial body, you don't have to be peaceful. Article 5 is return and rescue. If you see an astronaut in distress, you have an obligation to rescue that person. And again, I think I harken back to that Dear Moon mission. When we have 13 social media influencers on the far side of the moon and something goes wrong, does Article 5 kick in? Are they astronauts for the purposes of the agreement? And Article 6 is the one where it comes back. And this is a really important provision because it says states shall bear international responsibility for the national activities in outer space, whether they are governmental agencies or non-governmental entities. So what does this mean? This means that if I'm here on Earth, think about it, and I cross over into Canada and I steal 4 gold bars, and I come running back to the United States. United States, we have an extradition treaty with Canada. United States will send me back to Canada and I will have to face justice in Canada. But let's pretend I buried those gold bars somewhere. Nobody can find them. The US is not liable to Canada for those gold bars. The US has done everything it has to. It's returned me to Canada, and that's the end of its obligation. If I do the same thing on the moon, I go into the Canadian base, and even if the United States doesn't even know I'm on the moon, and I go and I steal those 4 gold bars, and I bury them somewhere on the moon, I don't tell anybody, extradition treaty kicks in, the United States sends me back to Canada to get justice. But under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, the United States owes Canada for those gold bars, even though it had nothing to do with it. This is very, very unusual in international law. So we see this very onerous obligation, and that's why we have such a robust regulatory environment for SpaceX, for launches and reentries and so forth. I have, again, what does conformity mean? Because activities are carried out in conformity. Interesting that it doesn't say that, your non-governmental entities shall abide by. So again, some wiggle room, some gaps there, and so forth. Article 7 is your basic liability provision. Again, the interesting thing here is that we have 4 different concepts of who is liable. The launching state is liable, but the launching state can be the state that actually launches, the state that procures the launch, the state from whose territory it's launched, or the state from whose facility an object is launched. So a SpaceX rocket is launched from the United States. The United States would be the a launching state. But if you are Saudi Arabia or you're a Saudi Arabian company and you are payload on that, then you are the state that procures the launch, and Saudi Arabia would also be considered a launching state. There's an entire convention that speaks to the international liability. Again, an interesting feature here. If something happens and there's damage on Earth or to an airplane in flight, the liability is absolute. We don't care whose fault it is. If it happens in space, if one satellite collides with another, then we have a negligence standard. And I always say I want to be the first attorney to do due diligence in space, because I would love to have any excuse to go there. Article 8 says that if you send something to space, you will always maintain ownership of it. You can never lose your responsibility for an article. You can't say, oh, that satellite doesn't work anymore, so I don't have to worry about it. You will always have the liability for that object. And there is a registration convention, and you actually have to tell the United Nations when you launch something. And this is, if you can go find this, Google the space registry, the UNUSA space registry, and you'll see. Now, and you'll also see that you only have to tell them where you are going. And we know that objects in space are constantly being pulled down by gravity, and they're constantly being repositioned, but you don't have to tell anybody that. And so that's why we're seeing all of these issues with space traffic management and space domain awareness, because we don't know exactly where everything is. The only other limit on your ability to use space is this Article 9. You will implement your activities in space with due regard to the corresponding interests of all other states parties. What does due regard mean? To you, probably it makes sense, be considerate. For lawyers, it's a balancing provision. So we don't have a bright line rule about what due regard means. Anytime something goes wrong, think about it. If you own a company and somebody gets too close to you, runs over your operation, you don't automatically say, hey, you owe me because you busted up my spacecraft. You have to go through this balancing test, and the court's going to look at the different interests that were impinged and then make a decision. That's a lot of time and money you're going to spend on lawyers instead of explorations. So I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I see I'm already at 45 minutes. But Article 9 also says you are to avoid the harmful contamination of other celestial bodies and changes in the environment of Earth. It's generally interpreted to mean that we're going to follow COSPAR, which is the Committee on Space Research, which has categorized other celestial bodies. Interestingly, the United States, that bill that I showed you, that states that the United States doesn't consider space to be a global commons, also states that it basically is not going to feel obligated to follow the COSPAR recommendations. Article 9 also says if you think you're going to harmfully interfere with somebody else, you shall have an international consultation. So again, look at that. It doesn't say don't interfere. It says tell somebody in advance if you're going to interfere. Article 11 is just a provision of announcing to the UN what activities you're going to undertake. Article 12 we spoke about briefly already. It presupposes that there will be installations. And then these are just sort of the administrative provisions. You can have an amendment, you can withdraw. This is how we implement Article 6 in the United States. It's Title 51. We have 3 government agencies involved: the Department of Transportation through the FAA. It licenses launch and reentry. It's licensing spaceports, payload, human spaceflight, and spaceflight participants, but only on launch and reentry. The Department of Commerce is in charge of remote sensing satellites. and the FCC handles all radio frequency requests. That Commercial Space Act of 2023 would move a lot of space activities to be the purview of the Department of Commerce. And so all of the activities that weren't mentioned in that previous slide, all the new things we're thinking about, in space traffic, in space manufacturing, debris cleanup, this bill suggests that it should all go to the Commerce Department. The Biden administration has said, no, we have our own idea. Why don't we send robotic missions will be licensed by the Commerce Department, and human missions will be licensed by the Transportation Department. Of course, I have an opinion on this. I have an opinion on a lot of things. When you think about the Transportation Department and you think about what they do, having them manage human missions wherever they go in space is literally like me parking in my driveway and still having the Transportation Department tell me, what kind of stove I ought to have in my house. But the commercial industry is not happy with the Biden proposal, and so it remains to be seen. Right now, both bills are being discussed in Congress. So hopefully that gives us enough time for questions. I leave you with this picture of the boot print. That's the motto of For All Moonkind, is that we need to protect that boot print. Right now, there's nothing stopping any one of those hundreds of missions that are planned for the moon going and erasing that blueprint, either on purpose or inadvertently. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Helena has a question.
Yeah, so you just gave the boot print as a good example, but I was just wondering if you could elaborate on some more examples of like what is human heritage in space and what that means.
So there are about 112 sites on the moon with evidence of human activity. So think about Luna 2 was the very first object to impact another celestial object. So it did a hard impact on the moon back in 1957. Luna 9 was the first human-made object to ever make a soft impact on the moon. Apollo 11, the first ever mission to put humans on the moon. All of that hardware is still there. Chang'e 4, the first successful mission to the far side of the moon. And so, think about all of that hardware is there. You can see it. We have a lunar reconnaissance orbiter taking pictures. You can see the footpaths from the LRO. So all of those are sitting there pristine, 112 different sites like that. Now, we're not suggesting all 112 sites need to be protected. We're not suggesting that every single rover we send to Mars needs to be protected, but some of those sites need to be protected. I hope that you get to go and see the Apollo 11 museum and see that actual boot print. That's what we're trying to protect.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the chat, Kirby asked, did you always plan to go into space law? If not, what made you want to get involved in it?
So great question. No, I spent 25 years as a mergers and acquisitions attorney, starting off in big law in New York City and then branching out on my own. It actually, I blame my children. Well, I should say I always wanted to be an astronaut. I was a child of Star Trek. I thought that I thought I was going to be an astronaut. I thought I would be living on the moon by now. And then I took calculus and I was like, okay, law it is. Which isn't true anymore, I understand, but back in the day there wasn't a lot of support if you didn't just get it. So I put the astronaut dreams behind me. I loved my career in M&A work. I really, as you can see by the way I read the Outer Space Treaty, I love the way contracts come together and the words on them. But my son, when he was about 11 years old, read a book called Who Owns the Moon by one of my colleagues, Virgil Pupp. And he said, Mom, I really want to mine asteroids when I grow up. And you seem to be like a pretty good lawyer, pretty competent. Do you think you can figure out the whole property thing? That there's this article that says you can't own property. Do you think you can figure that out in time for me to and I was intrigued and I sort of did a little digging, and then that's the first time I realized space law was a thing and that I could go and earn my LLM. And after 25 years of making lots of money for other people, I thought this would be a good time to do a shift and maybe give back a little bit. And so I went and earned my advanced degree in air and space law. I have not figured out the whole property thing yet, and my son is now working at SpaceX, so he hasn't started that asteroid mining company yet, so I have a little bit more time.
Peyton?
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today. So you talked a lot about kind of like these international laws and how it's kind of everyone's racing and everything. And I was just wondering, does having a background or knowledge about like other countries, all of these organizations really help in this field? Like maybe are there certain majors if someone is interested in going into this kind of law that would really help to have a background in?
Absolutely. I teach a course here at the law school called Astropolitica, where we are just looking at geopolitics because, even though we're going to space, we are bound by what we have built here on Earth. And understanding why countries make certain decisions is really important to understanding what they're going to do in space. So I would say, doing anything in international politics, international comparative politics, political science degree, anything that gets you into that sort of that diplomacy and understanding how treaties are made, how countries relate to each other, history, getting a history of foreign policy, also really important. So anything like that, and that's whether you are interested in becoming a professor or becoming general counsel to SpaceX, because you have to, if you are trying to get a license from the U.S. government, you have to understand what is binding the U.S. government, and you have to be able to say to the U.S. government, no, look, you can grant me this license because I know that this is how it's going to work out with China, or I know that this is China's attitude.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, Maya had a question in the chat. Do all law schools offer classes on space law, or are there more specialized programs?
No, they do not. We're seeing more and more, but I would say only a handful of law schools in the United States, in the world, offer space law classes. You're going to see introduction to space law at Georgetown, Vanderbilt, Harvard, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, and maybe UConn, and maybe a handful more that I'm not that are escaping me. But the fact that I can name them shows you how new this area is. But all of those programs have popped up in the last 2 years. So this is definitely a growing field. Now, this is my plug for Mississippi. We offer more space law classes than any other school in the entire world. We offer 8 very different perspectives on space law, everything from comparative international space law to problem solving in space law, which is to trade compliance in space law. But we also, have an incredible LLM program. And so I do encourage people to go to the best law school you can get into, and then come and join me for your LLM program afterwards.
Carter?
Hi, this is really my first exposure to space law, so this is kind of a niche field that I was interested in, or not that I now am curious about, but would you say that, like, is it constantly changing and evolving, or is it just a field that is kind of waiting for the technology to catch up for it to start to
Oh my
actively
goodness.
change?
It's the exact opposite. The
Okay.
technology is out there and the law's like,
All right.
oh, hey, yeah, you can do that. So this is the most exciting, like these next 10 years of space law are the most exciting because this is the formative stage of everything, right? I mean, if you are interested in like making a huge impact on the future of all humanity, then you want to be in space law, because we're looking at things like if China's going to be mining that asteroid, can I mine the asteroid next to it? Can I mine on that same asteroid? Who's going to have the access to this stuff? How do we share the benefits? How do we make sure global South countries are able, even though they can't launch a rocket, are able to appreciate and share the benefits of all this wonderful exploration? What's it going to look like for a human community on another celestial body? And the moon's 3 days away, but what's it going to look like when you're on Mars, which is 4 months away? These are all things we have to figure out, both at a national level and an international level. So this is, and I love teaching space law, but it's really hard because every year space law changes. And so it's not like I can just sort of pull out the slides from last year. I have to go back through everything and figure out what's going on. And it changes even while we're in the classroom. And a lot of what we do in the classroom is look at, oh, look, they just issued a notice of public rulemaking. What do we think of it? It's really, really dynamic, and the law is playing catch up big time to the technology.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sam?
For space law, when you're talking about the moon, do the laws that talk about having things built on the moon cover like airspace for the moon as well? Like Earth has different airspace rules, or is it stuff physically in contact with it?
So that's a really great question, because you're thinking, okay, I can't build on a celestial body, but what if I'm not really on it? Like, how far off of it do I have to be to not be on that celestial body, right? And then if I'm not on that celestial body, and I'm going to take this in the dark turn, right? Then that means if I can have a hovercraft 6 feet off the lunar surface that has weapons on it, right? Because I'm not on the moon then. We don't know. None of those laws exist at this point. We literally, what I went through today are the laws that we have with respect to the lunar surface and other celestial bodies. So this is something that we're going to have to figure out.
Anthony?
Yeah, so it's for anyone who's interested in the LLM track for space law. I was just wondering which areas of law, at least in just general law school, supplement the track well, because I know international law and intellectual property seem to be good choices, but I want to know if there's any other areas, or are there any other areas that might be useful in the future?
You must understand and learn administrative law if you want to work in space. Whether you want to, doesn't matter what you want to do in space. You have to know administrative law, because the U.S. government's going to be the biggest client for space industry for a while. It really depends on what you want to do with your LLM in space law. If you want to become a professor, then you really want to stick in that public international track and think about again, disarmament law would be something good to study. If you want to end up on the commercial side, then you're going to want to study all your business laws, the contract law, secured financing law, and corporate law, because there are going to be in the next decade, there are going to be a lot of startups in space that are going to need that kind of background.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we have time for one last question, Helena.
Yeah, so I was wondering, you gave a lot of evidence of how the US policy framework integrates the commercial interests a lot. And I was wondering how that compares in other countries.
So the United States has the most robust commercial industry. We have the only sort of comparable countries to us are the UK, Luxembourg, and UAE. They have very robust commercial. Most every other country, you're going to see a public-private partnership between the government and that company. China has announced that it has a bunch of commercial entities, but they're really owned by the Chinese government. So what we're seeing though is there's a big push, and this is what is also happening at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, is any country that like Rwanda has applied for a license for 300,000 small satellites. And now there are countries saying to Rwanda, okay, that's great, good for you, but remember, you have these obligations also. And that private company that has asked you to get those licenses for it, you are going to be responsible for what they do. So there is the UN, there's actually an Office of Outer Space Affairs, and they do a very good job of, we call it capacity building understanding of space law as the countries need it.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any last minute questions to ask? No? Okay, well, thank you so much, Michelle. This has been so educational. I knew absolutely nothing about space law before this, and I'm sure a lot of our members can attest to that as well. So thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us and for just being here as our guest tonight. I hope you have a great night, and everyone, the attendance is in the chat. Don't forget to fill that out. It's 10 points for this GBM, so get your points in for the end of the semester.
And I can share my slides with you, Sydney, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Yes, I will definitely send them in our group meet. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.